everyone else has like cute cats that just sleep on the floor while they're filming, or dogs that come in for a cuddle, and I have a rabbit that likes to act like a fucking woodpecker and make the most noise in the world. The words were on their way, and when they arrived, Liesl would hold them in her hands like the clouds, and she would ring them out like the rain. I sound like a frog. So The Book Thief is essentially a coming-of-age story, but it happens to be set in the lead-up to and then during World War II. It follows the story of Liesl, who is a young German girl. She's around 9 when the story starts, and she's somewhere between the age of 14 and 15 when the story ends. And as you read the story, you watch Liesl grow up, you watch her develop her own moral standing, and then try and reconcile that viewpoint that she's just developed against the backdrop of Nazism and the doctrines of World War II. One of the interesting things about this book is that it is narrated by death, which really brings to the foreground, or forefront, but not forefront, as I have said for like 7,000 times now, the theme of death, which is clearly going to be one of the main themes in the book. You can't write a book about war without it covering the concept of death. Another interesting thing about this book, at least as far as I was concerned, was that it actually shows the lives and experiences of the average German citizen during World War II. I thought this was really interesting because most of the books about World War II tend to be either from the soldier's perspective or from the perspective of the Jewish populations who were completely massacred during the Holocaust, which makes perfect sense. That is the main atrocity that occurred during the war. But I think in order for us to avoid potential of even small kinds of genocide, say for example Islamophobia in the world today, we need to be focusing on the average citizen and the ways in which the average citizen can either perpetuate or be led to accidentally perpetuate this kind of oppression that is going on during circumstances like the Holocaust. So I thought that that was really interesting that we have this book that kind of explores the experiences of the average citizen in a country like Germany during World War II, and that is definitely one of the reasons why I would strongly recommend reading this book. The plotline itself was actually relatively simple. It was basically just a summary of events that happened to fill in this time period from when the book started to when the book ended. Basically like an autobiography or like a historical account. This is with the exception of the excessive foreshadowing, which I will talk about later on in this review. I didn't feel like the story was particularly driven by a need to know what happens next. It wasn't like that kind of fast-paced, plot-driven novel, which I thought worked really well because this is the story of a child growing up. So it made sense that the events that were happening in the plot were more... So it made sense that the events that happened in this story were more sort of seemingly irrelevant memories of a child growing up rather than things that kind of link to one long storyline. The ending of the book was obviously much more plot driven. This is an event that is foreshadowed basically from the first chapter of the book, and anyone who has read this book or seen the movie will know exactly what I'm talking about here. But I felt like everything in the lead up to that moment or that event was actually very disconnected and kind of really only linked in a temporal sense, as in this is what happened here and then this is what happened next, than in any kind of thematic progression of the storyline or plotline sense. Does that make sense? I don't know, but that's how I felt about it anyway. More like a collection of memories than like any particular event that's going to help progress the story. All in all though, I felt that the plot was filled with some very heartwarming scenes, some life-changing moments, some challenging moments for the protagonist Liesl, and of course the obligatory flood of tears in the final few chapters. The characterization in this book, in my opinion, was actually a little bit disappointing. I felt like most of the characters had very trope-like characteristics, and any development in their characterization was also very cliche. For example, the woman who looks tough on the outside going to be a favorite once you see how soft and kind-hearted her inside is. That is the rabbit climbing onto the computer. That is the rabbit climbing over my lap. I felt the same for the development of the relationships in the book as well. I felt like you saw exactly where they were going to go as soon as you were introduced to the characters at the start, and then their relationships and their characters developed in exactly the way that you expected them to. But of course, I know that I'm probably judging this book against the backdrop of some of the more literary books that I've read recently, and that probably is a little bit too harsh because this is a YA book. So it makes sense that the characterization is probably going to be a little bit more simple. I didn't think that there was anything particularly harmful or problematic in the characters or the relationships that were being written about in this book. And I do think that they're just sort of generic characters and relationships that would be good for young children to explore and to be exposed to. I'm not sure if that's the word that I'm looking for. So I don't really have a problem with this. It's just that I have probably become used to sort of reading characters that were a bit more complex and a bit more three-dimensional, and I didn't think that the characters in this book particularly were. Along with the characterization, I was actually a little bit disappointed by the writing style in this book as well. It felt to me to be kind of painfully obvious at times that this was written by a younger and possibly less experienced writer, for a few reasons, really. The first one being the foreshadowing that I've already mentioned twice in this video. It really started to get on my nerves by the end of the book that every chapter the narrator would be saying something like, oh, so-and-so only has a few more months to live, or it was only a matter of time before so-and-so did such and such, followed by a little comment of, oh, oops, I ruined the story for you, didn't I? But let's keep reading anyway. And honestly, that drove me mental. It felt a lot like you were basically being hit over the head with a hammer. Like, there wasn't anything subtle about the foreshadowing that happened in this book. It was very blunt. It was just like smashed into your face. Like, this is what's gonna happen. Get ready to cry. You're gonna cry. Are you ready to cry yet? And that started to get on my nerves by the end of it. Because I think that foreshadowing needs to be a more subtle thing. It needs to be sort of done in terms of dramatic irony and, you know, subtle sentences that make you think something's going on here and I feel like something isn't right, but I'm not sure what it is yet. Whereas in this story, you did not get that at all. It was at the end of every chapter, you'd get something like, this happiness isn't gonna last. And that, to me, was the sign of a not very strong writer, or not very strong writing style. The other thing that kind of disappointed me a bit was that this motif of colors is basically brought up on the very first page. The narrator, Death, kind of on the first page tells you that he notices colors and that colors are kind of his thing and he's always noticing colors. And you'd expect from that this would provide you the opportunity to create some really, really beautiful, unique, interesting metaphors and descriptions using colors in a unique and interesting way. And I didn't think that that happened as much as it could have in this book. I felt like the narrator spent more time telling you that he noticed colors than actually noticing colors. So every few chapters he'd be like, oh, remember how I noticed colors? Yeah, I noticed colors. I noticed colors way more than you notice colors. And then he'd forget about it. So instead of this motif of color being sort of intricately woven into the storyline, it was just kind of very bluntly put forward every few chapters or so as he stated to you that he notices colors again. So I think the main problem that I have with this was that that kind of stuff that should be more of a subtle tapestry in the background of the story was just brought to the foreground too much, and it felt too obvious and it felt too, what's the word? Unskilled or something like that. That being said, I don't really want to judge this book too harshly because, for one, it is an early work of an author and we all know that artistry is progression, so you can't you expect things to get better with future works. I will talk more about the concept of colours as a motif in the book during my discussion video, so if you feel like I'm being too harsh here and you want to fight me on my opinion here, I'll meet you over in the discussion video. So aside from that, I did think that this book had some very lovely and also important themes that it explored, which I will talk about more in my discussion video as well, because that's what my discussion videos are for. But I will say, like I said in my January wrap-up video, this book explored the concept of freedom of speech and how important it is to have freedom of speech, and also, of course, of the power of words, which I think is particularly important literally in this very, very world that we are living in right now with the current political climate. The use of words to paint a particular group of people in a particular light is very, very important. The use of propaganda in producing fear. Basically all of that stuff this book explores. And the fact that Hitler could gain such power over Germany using propaganda and beautifully written speeches and, you know, powerful words and all that kind of stuff, which I will talk about more in my discussion video if you're interested in any of that at all. Fun fact, a lot of the little scenes and events in this book are actually inspired by memories of Mark Zusak's parents, who were in Germany and Austria during the war. So most of these little events are actually based on events that really happened and stories that Marcus was told as a child growing up, which I thought was really cool. Anyway, so this is a bit of a long review, and in spite of all of the little gripes that I have about the quality of the characterization and of the foreshadowing and the sort of theme writing, I did really enjoy this book. Like, I would like to make that clear, that I did enjoy reading this book, and there's a lot about this book that I thought was very, very sweet. I'm trying not to hold this book to too high a standard of judgment, because I know that this was written for a YA audience, and I also know that books don't need to be intricately and beautifully written in order to be good. I did enjoy reading this book. It had some really, really heartwarming moments in it, and of course I cried an absolute truckload at the end. Truckload is a weird word to say that you cried a number of, but that's beside the point. I would show you my rating for this book, but to be honest, you won't understand it until I actually make my video explaining my rating system, so in the meanwhile, have some footage of a rabbit. Careful. Yes, I thought so. Yes. Yes. What is it about books that makes you want to eat them so much? Ooh, I'm stripy. Look. Stripes. Stripes.